Hello and welcome to CFA Society New York's podcast, Compound Insights. I'm your host, Rob Rowan with CFA Society New York. Today we're talking with Dan Duggan, PhD, who is Vice President of Goldman Sachs and leads the GS DataWorks project. Dan's role focuses on incorporating alternative data within equity and macro research into the investment process. Before joining Goldman Sachs in 2015, Dan was a particle physicist. He was a senior fellow at CERN and a distinguished researcher at Fermi National Laboratory. Dan has a BS in physics and BAs in math and French from Indiana University, an MS and a PhD in experimental high-energy particle physics from Florida State. So Dan, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Rob, for having me.
I'd like to start with something I'm sure a lot of members are thinking about as they work for investment management companies that are perhaps more traditional. What does your day look like when you sit at the intersection between data science and traditional investments?
Well, thanks, Rob. I think it's a really interesting question. I will say that, especially in the current environment, where there are so many different questions, where you can have maybe more real-time, more granular views in terms of what's happening, they tend to be very busy days. And if I think about my role, is as kind of a broad overlay for worldwide equity and worldwide macro, there are a lot of different questions that are popping up. But at the end of the day, we think about things in the same way, and I try to think about things in the same way as a traditional analyst would. What's driving this? How do we quantify that? And then, living in a fundamental space, I try to make sure that we use a fundamental lens to be able to evaluate that. And that last point, it might seem really obvious, but this is one of the most crucial points as you think about larger integration. And as you think about the evolution of this space, is because that was actually, for me, coming from a very different background, the hardest part to get right is understanding what that lens looks like.
Sure. When I was prepping for this, I was thinking about how important the integration topic is, because we could build exceptionally good data science resources. If they're not appropriately brought into the investment management process, we have nothing. So without saying too much about your firm or anything else, how do you think the industry is doing with the integration of data as a whole?
Look, one thing I'll say, and I think this is going to be a common response, is that there's no one size fits all to the answer here, and I think we're in early innings, right? As you think about it, and the reason why I say no one size fits all is that ultimately, the path to and the evolution of this space, it's going to be driven by what the management, what that space looks like in terms of what drives success, identifying success and identifying where value add is. And that's going to look different if you're a very large buy side firm, if you're a bespoke small firm to where you're looking at more esoteric trades, esoteric names, or in my seat on the sell side, we answer questions in a different way because our function is a little bit different in this ecosystem.
Okay. I think it's interesting you characterized us as early innings in this. Why do you think that? Do you give that in terms of development of the technology, the firms, et cetera?
And I think about it in terms of the different components. And we also hire in this space and we look at the evolution of skill sets. And what you're seeing right now, and maybe I'll use this as a good way to think about the evolution of quants, is that I go back to that early period, and that was predominantly filled out by physicists, right, or people outside of the field coming in with with specialization in a skill set that matched an ultimate need, or a place where you could find an edge in the market. And then that's evolved, and you have much more of a foundational network and support structure around. From an education standpoint, you have experts in the field at various levels of maturity. And as I think about that time scale for something like data science, that's still nascent. And by that I mean, you're not necessarily, you're starting to see these classes pop up in the last few years, but in terms of this robust structure around it and support structure and understanding of the implications of all of this, it's still really evolving quickly.
Okay. And I guess, could you look forward and say what you think will happen in the future, near future, of the data science and integration?
One of the things that I'm looking for in terms of a signal is for, and I think you can think about, and again, I draw some parallels back to quant, but just even in this space, if you think about the nature of a fundamental analyst, I'll take that as an example. What do they do in their database, in their day-to-day? They're actively acquiring data. They're actively looking across that data to say, does this make sense? They're building models out of that, and then they're coming to investable research results. And if you pick that apart, and this is again, as I think about what these next stages look like, I think you're going to see more widespread understanding that those are actually very different roles when you talk about data science.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to see that, and I actually was at a, New York, this was an R convention 6 years ago, where they, the biggest, the headline talk was, people don't recognize that these are multiple roles, specialized roles within data science.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still seeing that in the, in the financial industry, where people talk about data science, but really they mean data engineering.
Mm-hmm.
How do we scale some of our operations? How do we think about the infrastructure that's really relevant for scaling these? How do we think about it from a data architecture standpoint? How do we want people to be able to actually lever
Mm-hmm.
the insights that we're getting? At what level? And then from a data analysis perspective, you have that, that data scientist who, who's really the data analyst, who really understands key statistical techniques, but can then translate that into, I would say, the investable ideas, or then translating that back. And so, as I think about those next steps, is really just better segmentation and better language around those different rules, and then how you build teams around, around that from a wider space perspective.
Okay. Regulation is always around, but over the coming years, do you expect regulation to play a role in any of that?
I mean, most certainly, right? And you can think about this in terms of, and we think about regulation in terms of, I'm just thinking about a couple of different examples here. One, from the way that you treat data internally and what you can do.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because, and I mentioned, being on the sell side, we distribute insights to our clients. And as you think about the ways that we can and can't use that data that come in, especially as you scale it, that becomes more of an important mechanism to tell a data-driven story. And then, the rights and controls around that. And then thinking about PII, what that means, so personally identifiable information
Mm-hmm.
in this space also becomes important. Thinking about geolocation, now marry that with the phone book, things become, you really have to be thoughtful about the processes that you're using, things like GDPR. So as you think about European protection rights, this spans across the space of, apps, as you think about, different ways that people identify themselves, treatment of cookies. All of these are still ongoing, and they touch our space in different ways. So those conversations still happen. And then you have, a secondary. So one, I would just say, thoughtful about the way that, there are sensitivities around the data themselves, the contracts. But then third, you can really think about this in terms of, what does it mean to have appropriate safeguards in a big data environment, to where you have vendors that are in a space that are working with corporates and then also working in investors, and what are the safeguards that are being put up there, from a regulatory perspective. And I think that's where the lens has started shifting, and I expect that to continue.
Interesting. So at this point, what proportion roughly of your data that you use on a day-to-day basis is in-house versus outsourced?
I guess, as you think about outsourced versus insourced, do you mean, I guess I could answer that in a couple different ways.
Sure. Let me put it more frankly then. Did you build it or buy it?
So look, anything that we can, that it makes sense to buy, and you think about this as a value proposition.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that you can buy, and where you get the equivalent level of insight, then that potentially allows you to scale. And then the questions are, what kind of impact? And it goes back to these foundational questions of what is the impact, what is the value, and what is the goal of the team. In a sense, that's no different than our analysts who are fundamental analysts having a subscription to a data set. Where do where does one draw the distinction? I'll give an example, in terms of where we pull those in, from a scaling perspective, and you're able to do more sophisticated things with the data inputs that we get. We can publish on them, we can draw insights, and then we can take that to the next level. So I would say it's a combination of both. We try to keep things as simple as possible wherever we can. And when there's value, then we'll go the extra mile to be able to do things ourselves. And then that's where we think about the real differentiation instead of just table stakes.
Right. You are the first data scientist we have had on our calls or any of our webinars that said, I try to keep things simple. It's not popular.
Well, but it's super important for the integration. And I don't mind, if you don't mind, I'll tell you a quick story.
Sure.
About when I first joined, and I think alluded to the fact that ramp was fairly steep. Right? How do you evaluate, if you have a satellite data vendor, how do you evaluate them? Well, wearing my physicist hat, I go, okay, well, I need to understand statistical uncertainties. I need to understand biases. And traditionally, if you ask that to, traditional analysts, they're going to say, okay, well, show me the correlations, the historical quarterly correlations. What's the R squared? Right? And it's like, okay. I actually have a number of these what I call learning experiences, but it's know your audience and know at the end of the day what that result will do, and then that gets driven by that that larger vision of what will this look like, and that helps drive in I would say integration long term.
Okay. So one of the other ways that I think is interesting to gauge where we are and where we're going is in terms of hiring. So what types of backgrounds and training are you hiring right now?
I think so, given where we are and, and the challenges I alluded to, is that one, communication, I cannot underscore that enough, is and because the idea is that when we're looking at the skill set of people that we're hiring right now, is that you first and foremost, you need to have a strong technical background.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to be somewhat interdisciplinary in the same sense that, while my key area is data analysis and I can do statistical analysis, I also understand how systems work.
Right.
And then from an investment standpoint, I also can speak the language of a fundamental investor and translate whatever results I need to be able to do in there. But that's predicated on over communicating, strong communication. And then the third component that I would say there is a strong interest in being able to answer and solve commercial opportunities.
Okay.
And it goes part and parcel with all three, but like without that last part, this is where you end up from a hiring perspective. And I've seen this where the people you hire have a tendency to answer what they think are interesting questions that have little to do from a commercial perspective of saying this actually moves the needle. And they say, no, wait. But I like this.
Right. So if you were to say meet a younger Dan who was, I don't know, at Indiana University getting a couple of different degrees at the same time, and said that younger Dan said, I want to get into data science at an investments company now, what should I study?
I mean, look, I think, one of the, I do think about, I wouldn't tell them to do anything differently in the sense that, a large part of the skill set that I employ right now, I actually learned from high energy particle physics.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of building up our infrastructure, our first passive infrastructure until we had a dedicated data architect.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what that topology looked like, it was helpful that I had the background that I did. In terms of the quantitative skill set, I mean, there's enough, from an educational standpoint to where you can say, okay, this is how I would do an analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But really from doing large scale and big data analyses, at at CERN, at Fermilab, those skill sets in terms of evaluating what are the right metrics, how do you understand whether you're getting something wrong or whether your techniques are biased and you don't know. Those are things that that from a manager's perspective you have to know when you're reviewing your juniors' works. You have to know when you're implementing something to where you don't have necessarily those same set of cross checks.
Uh-huh.
But the other thing that I always think about the example, even when I was back at university, or and granted this is before I started taking Python, but I think the core set of just a strong mathematics and quantitative analysis background is going to be helpful. One of the questions that I answered in my mathematical modeling class very long time ago was, where do you put hospitals if you have a grid, a city grid?
Oh.
And you have population.
Okay.
And how do you optimize that? And I think I wrote that in MATLAB at the time in terms of, right?
Right.
It was better than Mathematica. That's my hashtag there. Better than Mathematica. And I don't mean that broadly, but very specifically for these types of problems. But just breaking that down and saying, look, here are the conditions, here are the assumptions, and this is how you would optimize it based on these considerations. If you think about it, I mean, these are actually very similar to analyses that I run today with my team. And instead of asking, the question of a hospital, it's like, where should, what does Sweetgreen's saturation look like in New York City?
Right.
And then run that from a TAM perspective, or what does that overall growth look like? Those are similar types of questions. And I find myself thinking back to that college age Stan going, okay, those are the things I enjoyed. So.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. I think this has been really helpful to the members who are thinking about it. So thank you for being here, Dan.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you very much for having me.
And to everyone listening to the podcast, I would like to invite you to download the next one, which will be a conversation with Hightower's CEO. We'll be talking about RIA valuations. Until next time, I'm Rob Rowan, and this has been Compound Insights.